Hello everyone, and welcome back for more Limited Review Week here on my channel. I'm Ixalan, and so far this week we've covered the other 4 colors in Magic, and today we're covering green. Tomorrow I'll be back with multicolored artifact and lands. The day after that I'll be bringing you guys my archetype guide. For now we're doing green though, and remember these ratings are all based on how I feel about these cards before actually playing the format. They're my first impressions, and also if you want to know what the grades I give cards mean, you can go to the grading guide, which I have in the description below, a link to in the description below. So let's go ahead and get started with the first card, which is Ancient Brontodon, which is 6 generic mana and 2 green for a 9/9 dinosaur at common. This is the new largest vanilla creature ever, so that's kind of interesting. Also, I don't think it's terrible in this format, since decks, especially dinosaur decks, are going to want to be ramping. If you can drop a 9/9 on turn 6, which I think is plausible, you're doing pretty well. He is immune to a lot of the removal in the format, with only Destroy or Exile effects really working, and he is just a nightmare to have to block every turn. He's a good blocker too if you happen to be the one behind, although if you're behind, you play him and your opponent just kills him, you're probably dead. That said, it isn't an amazing card or anything. I think he's a C-. Most decks will cut it, but ramp decks have a nice option here at common. Next, we have Atzocan Archer, which for 2 generic and a green is a 1/4 human archer at uncommon. It has reach, as many archers do, and it says when Atzocan Archer enters the battlefield, you may have it fight another target creature, which means they both damage each other. At first, this card seems weird. I mean, how often is fighting and doing 1 damage going to be worth it? The answer is not very often, though sometimes you can play this to do 1 more damage to a creature with 3 or less power to take it down, or to kill an X1. The real value this card is supposed to give you, I think, is enabling Enrage, even though it's not that good for that either, since if you're going to use it to hit one of your guys with Enrage, chances are the Archer's not going to survive that either. You can also just play it as a 1/4 with Reach, which isn't a bad option. So basically, this is a flexible card that can do 3 different things, but it doesn't do any of them that well. I think it's just a solid C. Next, we have Blinding Fog, which for 2 generic and a green is a common instant, and it says prevent all damage that would be dealt to creatures this turn. Creatures you control gain hexproof until end of turn. I don't ever like fog effects in Limited. Usually they're good sideboard cards against board pumping effects. In this set we have Dinosaur Stampede, but I hate mainboarding them. Adding hexproof does give you a little more value, but not a ton. It does mean sometimes you'll actually trade a card when you play this, which is not the case with most fogs. With most fogs you're just trading, getting another turn basically to not die. I think this is still an F though, and really only a D out of the sideboard in very narrow situations. Next we have Blossom Dryad, which is 2 generic and 1 green for a 2/2 Dryad at common, and it can tap to untap a land. This is a good common. The ability to ramp is at the core of this format, especially in green, and Blossom Dryad does a pretty good job of it. I think it's a passable 2/2 body when it's also ramping for you. I think it's a first pickable common, and I'm going to give it a B-. Next, we have Carnage Tyrant, which for 4 generic and 2 green is a 7/6 dinosaur at Mythic Rare. It says Carnage Tyrant cannot be countered, and it has Trample and Hexproof. Another big dinosaur. This one is very efficient, giving you a 6 mana 7/6 with Trample and Hexproof is awesome. It also can't be countered, which will come up every now and again. While this isn't the most exciting, since it is basically French vanilla, it's a powerful card, a great dinosaur to ramp into, and difficult for opponents to interact with in combat. And I think it's first pickable. I think it's a B+. Next, we have Colossal Dreadmaw, which for 4 generic and 2 green is a 6/6 dinosaur at common, and it has Trample. Another French vanilla dinosaur, Colossal Dreadmaw is a solid top curve option at common for decks looking to go big in the late game. It swings hard, and Trample makes chump blocking not an option. It's a solid C. Next we have Commune with Dinosaurs, which is 1 green for a common sorcery, and it says look at the top 5 cards of your library. You may reveal a dinosaur or land card from among them and put it into your hand. Put the rest on the bottom of your library in any order. Apparently, Commune has come to mean sift through the top 5 cards of your library and pick something. We have seen it in the past with Commune with Nature and Commune with the Gods, and now we can do it with Dinosaurs. These cards are usually pretty solid because they drastically increase your card quality, letting you avoid drawing lands in the late game and hit what you really want. This one can actually also hit lands, and sometimes you're going to want a land, and it can help you do that, and that's a nice little bit of upside it has. I would say you need about 6 dinosaurs at a minimum to want to play this, but once you're there, it's a solid playable, and if you get higher than that, you're really getting there. It's an F in your typical limited deck, but I do think it's a C in decks with lots of dinosaurs. Next, we have Crash the Ramparts, which for 2 generic and 1 green is a common instant with target creature gets +3/+3 and gains Trample until end of turn. This is a decent combat trick. Having to pay 3 for tricks sometimes is not the best since your opponent can more easily play around them, but this one gives a huge power and toughness boost and trample, making an opponent's attempt to trade look really bad, and this is the kind of trick that will sometimes just end a game out of nowhere when you're just like, I guess I can take that, and then you're dead. It's still a trick, and only the best of those really get out of the lower C range, and this isn't quite the best of the best, but it's fine, and you'll play it in many green decks. I'm going to give it a C-. Next, we have Crushing Canopy, which for 2 generic and a green is a common instant, and it says, choose one, destroy target creature with flying, or destroy target enchantment. I like flexible sideboard cards, and that's basically what you have here. You can probably mainboard this and have it be mediocre since it can target 2 different things. Probably like a D in the mainboard, meaning you only play it if your draft went bad. But I think in an ideal world, you'd probably want one of these in your sideboard every draft if you're playing green. Killing flyers or enchantments means it can be sighted in against more than one kind of target, making it quite good. It is a kind of sideboard card that will almost certainly come in at least once during your matches. Like I said, it's a D mainboard, but probably a C+ out of your sideboard. Next, we have Deathgorge Scavenger, which for 2 generic and a green is a 3/2 dinosaur at rare. And it says, whenever a Deathgorge Scavenger enters the battlefield or attacks, you may exile target card from a graveyard. If a creature card is exiled this way, you gain 2 life. If a non-creature card is exiled this way, Deathgorge Scavenger gets +1/+1 until end of turn. This card has a ton of text on it, and it's pretty nice. The floor of this thing is that it is a 3/2 with a relevant creature type, something that would already be playable some of the time, but the big text box makes this card one you'll always play if you're in green. When it comes into play or attacks, you get to exile cards. Keep in mind they can be from either graveyard. You can choose to exile a creature to gain a bit of life, or non-creature cards to have this attack as a 4/3. Both of those options are solid. This is probably going to be more of a player in Constructed, but it's good in Limited too. I'm going to give it a C+. Next, we have Deeproot Champion, which for 1 generic and 1 green is a 1/1 Merfolk Shaman at rare, and it says, whenever you cast a non-creature spell, put a +1/+1 counter on Deeproot Champion. This card reminds me a lot of Quirion Dryad, which is one of my all-time favorite Magic cards. Kind of weird to see a prowess-esque non-creature spell trigger on a green card, but this seems pretty solid. You definitely need 6 or more non-creature spells to want to play it, and the more you get, the better it gets. But because it starts so small and can so easily be dealt with, I don't really want to give it more than a C+ or take it super early during a draft. Next, we have Deeproot Warrior, which for 1 generic and 1 green is a 2/2 Merfolk Warrior at common, and it says, whenever Deeproot Warrior becomes blocked, it gets +1/+1 until end of turn. This is a Grizzly Bears with a bit of upside between the Merfolk creature type and getting bigger when it gets blocked. Deeproot Warrior is a solid 2-drop, but nothing special. That's sort of the classic definition of a C. Next, we have Drover of the Mighty, which for 1 generic and 1 green is a 1/1 Human Druid at uncommon. And it says Drover of the Mighty gets +2/+2 as long as you control a dinosaur. And it says add 1 mana of any color to your mana pool. You have to tap it, obviously, for that effect. A 2-mana 1/1 who can add mana of any color would already be pretty good. Ramping and fixing on turn 2 isn't a super common thing in Limited, but this even comes with more text, actually becoming a reasonable creature who can attack and block if you have a dinosaur in play. It fits in well there because it can help you ramp dinosaurs into play that pump it up to 3/3. I would play this in a deck with 0 dinosaurs in it, where I think it's still a B- because ramping and fixing is so good. With dinosaurs, it pushes up to at least a B, though. Taking this with your first pick seems like a solid way to start a draft. Next, we have Emergent Growth, which for 3 generic and 1 green is an uncommon sorcery that says, target creature gets +5/+5 until end of turn and must be blocked this turn if able. This card just seems bad in most situations. It is a sorcery speed, so it's not really a combat trick with your opponent knowing what they are dealing with once you go to combat. Sure, it makes your opponent have to block a creature, but they can do it with any one of their creatures. It's not an effect that lets you choose what blocks or anything like that, and typically this will mean just getting chump blocked. You won't even always be trading 1 for 1 as there are creature tokens in this format. The only situation where it can be good is if your opponent has like 1 creature in play that you really need to kill, as this will basically do the job. But most of the time it won't be doing much because your opponent will have more than 1 creature in play, one they don't really mind losing a smaller creature to this. It is worth noting it works okay with Enrage because it'll give you an Enrage trigger no matter what because your opponent has to block it, but I think it's still an F. Next, we have Emperor's Vanguard, which for 3 generic and 1 green is a 4/3 Human Scout at rare, and it says whenever Emperor's Vanguard deals combat damage to a player, it explores. You already know I love Explore. I love Repeatable Explore even more. A 4-mana 4/3 is already a solid Limited card in the C or C+ range. Adding Explore every time this hits an opponent makes this amazing, and it can easily result in this snowballing you to a win, either because it's getting bigger or you're just drawing extra cards. This is a great green rare, a first pickable one that I'm going to give a B+. Next, we have Grazing Whiptail, which for 2 generic and 2 green is a 3/4 dinosaur at common, and it has reach. This certainly isn't exciting, but 4 mana 3/4 reach is actually pretty playable, something we don't see a lot for that amount of mana. Sometimes Giant Spider is playable, and this is obviously even better with 1 more power, in addition to also having Dinosaur creature type. I think most green decks will feel fine having 1 or 2 of these, and I'm going to give it a C+. Next, we have Growing Rites of Itlimoc, which for 2 generic and 1 green is a legendary enchantment at rare, and it says when Growing Rites of Itlimoc enters the battlefield, look at the top 4 cards of your library. You may reveal a creature card from among them and put it into your hand. Put the rest on the bottom of your library in any order. This is the green card in the cycle of legendary enchantments that transform into lands, and so it also says at the beginning of your instep, if you control 4 or more creatures, transform Growing Rites of Itlimoc. Transforms then into Itlimoc, Cradle of the Sun, which is a legendary land. You can add green to your mana pool by tapping it, or you can tap it and add green to your mana pool for each creature you control. So when you play the legendary enchantment half, you're getting some card selection. Most decks will have no problem hitting at least 1 creature with it, though you probably shouldn't be running this in a deck that doesn't have at least 15 of them, but that's the majority of limited decks. Transforming it isn't the easiest. You have to have 4 creatures in play at your instep. You'll do it eventually, but maybe not early. Once it does transform, you basically get Gaia's Cradle, one of the most busted lands of all time, and so you're getting some pretty incredible ramp. If your deck has a lot of mana sinks or expensive creatures, Itlimoc is going to be your best friend, producing insane amounts of mana for you. Though it's worth noting that that sort of pulls you in 2 different directions, because Growing Rites of Itlimoc wants you to run low curve creatures to transform it as quickly as possible, and then Itlimoc wants you to tap to play big things or use mana sinks. It's not that big of a problem really, because a lot of decks are going to have a higher curve and a lower curve in this format, I think. Still, this being difficult to transform and really only good in decks that are both creature heavy and running mana sinks for large creatures restricts this card to a B-. You can first pick it in a lot of packs, but a lot of the time taking premium removal and stuff like that is going to be better. Next, we have Ixalan's Diviner, which for 1 generic and 1 green is a 0/3 human druidic common, and it says when Ixalan's Diviner enters the battlefield, it explores. So green has a lot of explore, and this is another solid creature with it. A 2 mana 1/4 with some card selection, or a 2 mana 0/3 that draws me a card. I would probably play either of those. I wouldn't be overly excited about either of them, and that means this is a C, a serviceable 2-drop for green decks, and that even has some late game value thanks to explore. There's also some explore synergies running around that makes it a little better. Next, we have Ixalan's Keeper, which for 1 generic and 1 green is a 2/2 human shaman at common, and for 7 generic and 1 green, you can tap it and sacrifice it, and target creature gets +5/+5 and gains trample until end of turn. So we've seen the other 4 cards in this cycle. They're all 1 mana. The Keeper is 2, but it's also a 2/2, and because of that, I think it's just the best of the cycle. It is a Grizzly Bears in the early game, and in the late game, it can help you push through lethal damage by pumping one of your creatures. I think this is just a C+. Next, we have Jade Guardian, which for 3 generic and 1 green is a 2/2 Merfolk Shaman at common, and it has hexproof, and it says when Jade Guardian enters the battlefield, put a +1/+1 counter on target Merfolk you control. Keep in mind, this can put the counter on itself, and a 4 mana 3/3 with hexproof isn't too shabby. More frequently, you'll probably put the counter on another Merfolk, though. One that, because you put the counter on it, can now effectively attack your opponent, even the turn you play the Guardian. On its own, I think this is a solid C, since it can pump itself. In a Merfolk heavy deck, it's a pretty nice payoff, though, and I think it goes all the way up to B-. Next, we have Jungle Delver, which for 1 green is a 1/1 Merfolk Warrior at common, and for 3 generic and 1 green, you can put a +1/+1 counter on Jungle Delver. You could do worse as far as mana sinks go, I guess. Most of the time, you just don't want to play this, though, since it's going to be so bad in the early game. In the late game, it can help you run away with it for sure, and maybe you should side it in and grind your matchups. And there are decks that care about Merfolk and +1/+1 counters, and so that gives us a little bit of extra value. But I think this is still a D, something you just occasionally play and don't in most ideal scenarios. Next, we have Kumena's Speaker, which for 1 green is an uncommon Merfolk Shaman. It's a 1/1, and it says Kumena's Speaker gets +1/+1 as long as you control another Merfolk or an island. I think this is pretty obviously a card that only belongs in a green deck with 7 or more Merfolk, or in a blue-green deck. A 1 mana 2/2 is fine, but actually it isn't the most exciting thing ever. Though if you can consistently make it a 2/2 that can attack on turn 2, that's pretty great. It seems like it has more potential in Constructed, where having a 2/2 on turn 2 results in a greater advantage, where the board gets clogged and limited so frequently, and it'll get outclassed fairly quickly there. But it is a Merfolk, and that adds a little bit of extra value to it. I think it's a solid C. I mean, it's pretty solid as far as 1-drops go. So you'll play it, but it has to be in a blue-green deck or in a deck that has green in it and happens to have a decent number of other Merfolk in it. Next, we have Merfolk Branchwalker, which for 1 generic and 1 green is a 2/1 Merfolk Scouted uncommon, and it says whenever Merfolk Branchwalker enters the battlefield, it explores. This is an excellent 2-drop. It has a relevant creature type and uses the powerful Explore mechanic. It will either be a 3/2 that lets you do a bit of card selection, or it will be a 2-mana 2/1 that draws you a card. I'm happy with either mode, and I think this is first pickable in a large number of packs. I'm going to give it a B-. Next, we have New Horizons, which for 2 generic and 1 green is an enchantment aura at common with enchant land, and it says, when New Horizons enters the battlefield, put a +1/+1 counter on target creature you control. Enchanted land has tap, add 2 mana of any 1 color to your mana pool. This is good fixing and ramp. You even get to make one of your creatures bigger with a +1/+1 counter. This will be a key card in any deck trying to power out dinosaurs or other large creatures. It combos particularly well with Blossom Dryad. I'm going to give it a C+, and I think maybe this is even going to get a B- for me in the end. I may just be sort of still thinking about ramp spells the way I was thinking about them in Amen Keplock, where they were quite good by the time Hour of Devastation came out. But I do think this has the potential to be a B-. This set also looks pretty ramp heavy. We'll just have to see. Next, we have Old Growth Dryads, which for 1 green mana is a 3/3 Dryad at rare. When Old Growth Dryads enters the battlefield, each opponent may search his or her library for a basic land card, put it onto the battlefield tapped, then shuffle his or her library. This is admittedly a difficult card to evaluate. Obviously, 1 mana 3/3 is great. I always talk about how I want my 1 mana creatures to be relevant at any stage of the game. Well, that's one way to do it, by being a 3/3. But the downside here is pretty real. You ramp your opponent and maybe even fix for them. This means that on turn 2 they will have 3 mana and probably be able to play a creature that can just trade with this in the near future, if not on turn 3. I think this is just a solid C. The allure of a 1 mana 3/3 is enough to make the downside mean less, especially because in the later part of the game it's really not going to matter that much, but it's still a very real downside. Next, we have Pounce, which for 1 generic and 1 green is a common instant that says target creature you control fights target creature you don't control. This is an okay removal spell. Where it will really shine is when you use a creature with Enrage to do the fighting, but any deck with decent-sized creatures will play a copy of this. I think it's just a C+. Next, we have Ranting Raptors, which for 2 generic and 1 green is a 2/3 dinosaur at uncommon, and it has the Enrage ability, which means whenever it gets damaged, you may search your library for a basic land card, put it on the battlefield tapped, then shuffle your library. A 3 mana 2/3 with a relevant creature type who rampant growths anytime it gets damaged seems like a good deal to me. He also allows you to fix in ramp and will almost always give you value. Your opponent really isn't going to want to enrage him more than once, or they will be ramping you pretty far, and if you're a dinosaur deck, you've probably got some things to ramp into. But even if all you do is trade with one of their creatures and get a land, a pretty realistic scenario, you're coming out ahead. I'm going to give this a B-. Next, we have Ravenous Daggertooth, which for 2 generic and a green is a 3/2 dinosaur at common. It also has Enrage, but when it gets damaged, you gain 2 life. A 3 mana 3/2 that gains you 2 life is probably going to be what this is most of the time. Gains you 2 life when it dies. That's fine, but nothing special. I think it's a C. It does have a relevant creature type, so that's something to keep in mind. Next, we have Ripjaw Raptor, which for 2 generic and 2 green is a 4/5 dinosaur at rare, and it also has Enrage. This time, if it gets damaged, you get to draw a card. This is one of the better Enrage effects. It's on a rare card, so I guess that's the idea. Drawing a card anytime it gets damaged is excellent. Like many of the other creatures with Enrage, even in a medium scenario where you just trade with your opponent's creature, you're going to come out ahead. There will also be plenty of scenarios where your opponent just has to not attack you because you will get to draw a card off the attack, and they won't want to block it either. All of that comes on a very well-costed 4 mana 4/5 body. Sign me up. This is a B+, first pickable in mini packs. Next, we have River Herald's Boon, which for 1 generic and 1 green is an instant at common, and it says put a +1/+1 counter on target creature and a +1/+1 counter on up to 1 target merfolk. This is terrible in a deck without any merfolk, maybe borderline playable at D-, but I think that might be generous. With merfolk, it certainly gets better, since getting 2 +1/+1 counters for 2 mana is a real bonus, and can be used to take down a lot of creatures. It still isn't incredible, though it's worth noting there is a sort of a +1/+1 counter sub-theme within the merfolk deck, and this does a good job of illustrating that, but still I think this is about a C. Next, we have Savage Stomp, which for 2 generic and a green is an uncommon sorcery, and it says Savage Stomp costs 2 less to cast if it targets a dinosaur you control. Then says put a +1/+1 counter on target creature you control, then that creature fights target creature you don't control.
Here is a candidate for best uncommon in the set. Green lately has gotten some nasty fight effects, and this is one of the best we've seen. Even without Dinosaurs, this is a 3-mana Hunt the Weak, and Hunt the Weak has been a solid playable in the past, probably like a C+. Cutting a mana off of that probably gets this up to the B range. Then if your deck does have Dinosaurs, especially those with Enrage, things get ridiculous. And you can play this for a single green mana if you have Enrage. You're getting even more value. It does have the problem that all fight cards have. Don't play it if your opponent has a ton of mana up and a card in hand, because you can get really blown out. But if you're careful, this will be the kind of card that really swings the game in your favor. I think it's an A- in a dinosaur heavy deck, and this is a great first pick. Next we have Shaper's Sanctuary, which for 1 green is a rare enchantment, and it says whenever a creature you control becomes the target of a spell or ability an opponent controls, you may draw a card. This is kind of a weird card to evaluate, but I think I like it okay. Most players have 5 or 6 removal spells in their deck, and by the time your opponent plays 2 of those, you're coming out ahead. You're going to win the battle of attrition too if all your creatures are replacing themselves when your opponent casts removal. It can be particularly nasty against repeatable activated abilities that your opponents want to use on creatures. I think it is probably just a C, and I wouldn't take it early by any means, but I would feel fine about having it in green decks, and I can also see this ending up moving up as the format continues. It's one of those cards that's just not easy to evaluate without playing. You got to see how often you're drawing a card with it. Next, we're looking at Slice in Twain, which for 2 generic and 2 green is an uncommon instant that says destroy target artifact or enchantment, draw a card. Green gets another good sideboard card that can target 2 types of permanents, and this one also replaces itself. This isn't really something you want to mainboard, probably only a D there, but I think it is a B- out of your sideboard. You always want a copy of it in there, and you'll almost always side it in at least once per draft. Next we have Snapping Sailback, which for 4 generic and a green is a 4/4 dinosaur uncommon. It has Flash, and it says it has Enrage, which means in this case when it gets damaged you put a +1/+1 counter on it. This thing is a monster, obviously from the art and from what it does. A 5-mana 4/4 with Flash would already be almost a B- because you can flash it in to kill a lot of creatures. Anything that has 3 or less power, and you're getting a 2-for-1 probably, and sometimes you can flash it in and just get a 1-for-1, and that's sort of still makes it a mediocre removal spell. But this is even better because it comes with the Enrage mechanic and a relevant creature type, and getting bigger every time it gets damaged is pretty gross. This is particularly filthy when you flash them in to eat like a 3/3 or a 3/4, which means you have a 5/5 ready to swing on your opponent's next turn, and you just killed one of your opponent's creatures. That's a huge swing. I love this card. I think it's a first pick in most situations. It's a B. Next, we have Spike-tailed Ceratops, which for 4 generic and 1 green is a 4/4 dinosaur at common, and it says Spike-tailed Ceratops can block an additional creature each combat. This is pretty mediocre. We've seen tons of way sweeter dinosaurs just in this video, and certainly in the others, and this is the kind of thing you run if you're struggling to find enough dinosaurs for your dinosaur deck, and I think that means it's a D. Next, we have Thundering Spineback, which for 5 generic and 2 green is a 5/5 dinosaur uncommon. It's a dinosaur lord. It says other dinosaurs you control get +1/+1, and it has a strong activated ability where for 5 generic and 1 green you can create a 3/3 green dinosaur creature token with trample. So this costs kind of a lot, but as we've seen, there's treasure in other ramp in this format. It is even reasonable on its own without any other dinosaurs because it's a 7-mana 5/5 with an excellent mana sink ability that makes 4/4 dinosaurs with trample. As long as the Spineback stays in play, they'll be that big. In a deck with lots of dinosaurs, this is basically an ideal curve topper for your deck, as giving an Anthem effect to all your dinosaurs is just gross if you have several in play. It's a C+, an okay curve topper with powerful mana sink ability if you don't have a lot of dinosaurs. Then when you have a bunch, it gets even better, and I think it moves all the way up to B. You can probably spend an early pick on this and see if dinosaurs are open. This is just, it feels almost like it could be a rare, honestly, and that's a good sign for how strong a card is. Next, we have Tishana's Wayfinder, which is for 2 generic and 1 green, a 2/2 Merfolk Scout at common. And it says, when Tishana's Wayfinder enters the battlefield, it explores. You already know that I'm high on Explore, and that isn't changing here. This is either going to be a 3-mana 3/3 that gives you some card selection, or a 3-mana 2/2 that draws you a card. I will take either of those. Also, it's a Merfolk. It's not incredible, but I think most green decks would probably play like a whole play set of these and not be too sad. I'm going to give it a B-. I think it's even first pickable in some packs. Next, we have Verdant Rebirth, which for 1 generic and 1 green is an uncommon instant that says, until end of turn, target creature gains. When this creature dies, return it to its owner's hand. Draw a card. This is a cool design, and I think it is actually pretty solid because in most situations it will give you a 2-for-1. Your opponent either tries to trade with your guy or use removal on it, and then you use a Rebirth to get that creature back and draw the extra card. I don't see why I wouldn't want that in most green decks. It does have some pitfalls, of course. It's not a perfect card or anything. It can just rot in your hand if there's just a race going on and your opponent isn't doing anything to try to kill your creatures. I don't see why I wouldn't want this, though. Still, in most green decks, it gets even better with bombs and creatures with into the battlefield abilities, but I see myself running one in any green deck. You probably don't want more than that because it's so situational, but I'm going to give it a C+. Next, we have Verdant Sun's Avatar, which for 5 generic and 2 green is a 5/5 dinosaur avatar at rare. And it says, whenever Verdant Sun's Avatar or another creature enters the battlefield under your control, you gain life equal to that creature's toughness. On its own, this is a 7 mana 5/5 that gains you 5 life. That's pretty alright and would have been like a C- if that's all it did. 7 mana is a ton for a 5/5 body, so it's hard to give it something higher than that, but this also lets you gain life anytime you play another creature, life equal to their toughness. That's a nice little thing, but I honestly think there are better curve topper dinosaurs at lower rarities in this thing. We saw one of them in this video, the uncommon Dinosaur Lord, who also makes dinosaur tokens. By all means, though, if you're ramping, play this guy, but I wouldn't go after him super early. He just gets a C+ from me. Next, we have Vineshaper Mystic, which for 2 generic and a green is a 1/3 Merfolk Shaman at uncommon. And it says, when Vineshaper Mystic enters the battlefield, put a +1/+1 counter on each of up to 2 target Merfolk you control. This is an incredibly strong Merfolk payoff. It can put one of the counters on itself, so alone it can be a 3 mana 2/4, which is actually some pretty solid stats alongside the Merfolk creature type, alongside +1/+1 counter synergies. And I think it's a solid C, even if you never have any other Merfolk. In a Merfolk deck, this is a straight-up B, though. Because of the high floor and ceiling, this is something worth spending an early pick on and trying to go into Merfolk because, you know, worst case, it's a 3 mana 2/4, and that's really a pretty good deal. Next, we have Waker of the Wild, which for 2 generic and 2 green is a rare Merfolk Shaman, and it has an activated ability that you pay X and 2 green to put X +1/+1 counters on target land you control. That land becomes a 0/0 elemental creature with haste. It's still a land. So this might seem familiar. It's like the Awaken effect from back in Battle for Zendikar. A 4 mana 3/3 with a powerful mana sink ability, turning lands into creatures, is pretty attractive. It's the kind of ability that will just win games if they get drawn out, because even if you get flooded, you can keep making lands into creatures. You can even do it at instant speed, which is going to be a real headache for your opponent. Also, this is a Merfolk, and I think this is a solid first pick, and I'm going to give it a B. Next, we have Wild Growth Walker, which for 1 generic and 1 green is a 1/3 elemental at uncommon, and it says, whenever a creature you control explores, put a +1/+1 counter on Wild Growth Walker, and you gain 3 life. This is an amazing build-around, one I'm looking really fun to getting to play. It's obviously a huge payoff for Explore decks. On its own, it isn't unplayable. 2 mana 1/3s are certainly subpar, but they'll make your deck if you're desperate, which means this is like a D-. However, if you have 8 or more cards with Explore, I think this pushes all the way into the B range. I think he is a strong enough build-around that it'll be first pickable in some weaker packs since the upside is just so high. That does it for all the green cards in Ixalan. Tomorrow I'll be back with the last video covering the last cards in this set, which are the multicolored cards, the artifacts, and the lands. After that I'll be doing my archetype guide, so there's still 2 videos left in the limited review week. Just a reminder, you can head over to 5colorcombo.com, go to their store and use my discount code NEEDSAHONE5 to get a 5% discount. You can also download an awesome app that lets you practice drafting. It uses the grades from my set reviews to determine when AI will take the packs. So it does a pretty good job of picking the right cards. You won't see crazy cards around and stuff like that. So go ahead and check that out as well. Thanks for watching.